I'm Dr. John Letty, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I am one of the 2 clinical leads of the new Children and Young People's Neurodevelopmental Partnership, which is a new service in Somerset and is the autism assessment pathway and has a role in ADHD as well. So my role is mainly around autism, so I'll be focusing primarily on autism today, but we will be thinking about ADHD as well. I just want to help make some of the system understandable. I'm aware that some of you joining here might have been through previous assessment pathways for autism or ADHD. Some of you might be on the waiting list now or be thinking about accessing an assessment, and some of you may have been through the pathway recently. So what I plan to do today is go over the journey so far. So as many of you may know, we as a wider system in Somerset have been making lots of changes to services in Somerset, so I want to recap on some of that. I will then give a bit of an overview about our service, who we are, where we came from and what we do, before going into some more about the practical stuff and what you probably really want to know. How do we request an autism assessment or ADHD assessment? What happens to this request? And what actually happens in an autism assessment? As I said, the focus will be on autism, but I will give information about the ADHD pathway as well. If you've got any questions, there will be opportunity to ask them at the end of what I'm presenting. But if there is anything urgent or you want to explain further as we go through, please pop it in the chat. I have found a way to be able to read it and present at the same time. It may look like I'm not looking in the right direction, but if you put it in there, I'll be able to keep an eye on it as well. So, I wanted to start off just by acknowledging that the autism and ADHD pathways in Somerset historically have not been what they should be. They've not been good enough in many ways, and that has been made clear. There is system-wide agreement and acknowledgement that change is needed and improvement is needed. Many of you may be familiar with the CQC Ofsted report from 2020 that really laid that out in black and white and made it clear and was the catalyst for a lot of the change that's happened. I've put a quote here from that CQC Ofsted report, which I won't go into in depth. About the 7th word is dysfunctional, and I think that probably summarises and tells you everything we need to know. And it's something that we as assessment services agree with, that change is needed. So we think about what some of those challenges in the previous pathways were, and just acknowledging that they were existing. Services were fragmented. There were actually 7 assessment pathways in Somerset. Didn't massively talk to each other, and it was confusing to navigate. We know that on at least some of those assessment pathways, assessments were not conducted in a way that we would consider fully NICE compliant, so of good enough quality and robust enough. Services were also overwhelmed with huge amounts of demand, which they still are, but there was a high number of referrals requesting an autism or ADHD assessment for young people with needs that were not related to neurodiversity, and being put on the waiting list and accessing an assessment just acted as a barrier and a delay to accessing the support that they needed, which clearly wasn't in anyone's best interests. Because of that demand, the waiting list was closed in at least one area of Somerset, particularly in the West Somerset area for school-aged children aged 6 to 17, and that was in place for quite a long time, and understandably very frustrating to many families in Somerset. Previous services were very diagnosis-led, so their purpose was to come to a yes/no answer as to whether someone meets the criteria for autism. And actually, they weren't what we call a formulation-driven approach, which is seeking to understand that young person, because a diagnosis can tell you so much, but it doesn't tell you anything about that young person's individuality or how that need presents. And finally, communication was not always good enough between services and parents and other agencies in the system. So some of you may be familiar with Somerset's written statement of action. You don't need to remember all of this, but this basically says that was the framework for the improvement works that are happening in Somerset around autism and ADHD. It's identified quite a lot of improvement areas, one of which was the pathways for autism and ADHD, which is improvement priority 5. The work, which we've all been really heavily involved in, including our colleagues in the Somerset Parent Carer Forum, has been split into 3 work streams around the pre-assessment, assessment, and post-assessment and post-diagnostic support pathway. So I'm just going to go over those very quickly. The pre-assessment pathway is basically what should happen before someone comes for an autism assessment. Guidance has been given to schools on how they should be liaising with families, discussing needs, conducting a needs-led assessment and enabling support that is available locally to be accessed. Often, previously and still currently in some cases, there is a unhelpful narrative that people have to wait until after an assessment and/or diagnosis to access that support. Well, we know that is not and should not be the case. A diagnosis can help inform how that support is offered, and there are some doors it can open, but really it shouldn't do. The principle of the pre-assessment pathway is to enable a smooth transition, gathering a wealth of evidence about a young person that can inform the need for an assessment. That's why a lot of it happens in schools, but also working with the wider system as well in education, social care, and thinking about those who don't have access to schools, so home educated children, for example. It's also involved changes to referral pathways, how assessments are requested, which I'll come on to later, and the creation of a new request form. The assessment pathway is what we're really here to think about today. Our main aims in improving services is to simplify and streamline things to make them less fragmented and more joined up, having equal access across the county, making it understandable and simple for families, and crucially, reopening those closed assessment pathways. We need to ensure that everyone who needs an assessment is offered a good quality, NICE compliant assessment from a multidisciplinary team, which they weren't in the past. They were only conducted by paediatricians in most of the assessment pathways, as well as shifting from that diagnosis yes/no process to more of an understanding-based approach, formulation in clinical health speak. You'll notice I haven't talked about post-diagnostic support there. The co-production around that is really starting now, and we fully acknowledge that as a gap that needs to be filled, but as yet very little has been done in that space. So coming on now to us, the Children and Young People's Neurodevelopmental Partnership, or CYPNP as we've tried to make shorter and simpler to say. I'm not sure we've necessarily succeeded in that. We came about because there was a decision to close 4 of the previous autism assessment pathways. So the pathway at Yeovil District Hospital, offering assessments to children aged 5 to 17. The one that was closed at Musgrove Park Hospital for 5 to 17-year-olds, and the 2 based in CAMS as well. And we've replaced those with 1 assessment pathway for the whole of Somerset, apart from this little pocket up in the East Mendip area that's with a different trust. So what was previously within the Yeovil and Musgrove area is now all within our area. And we are the single assessment pathway for East and West Somerset. So we're a new service, exactly as that says. We're a collaboration between Yeovil District Hospital NHS Trust and Somerset FT. And what we've done is we've taken the expertise from clinicians across the system and brought them all together in one place to create a multidisciplinary team consisting of paediatricians, clinical psychologists, speech and language therapists and occupational therapists from our colleagues in the Children and Young People's Therapy Services, or SITS, and colleagues in education psychology as well, so with an interagency focus there to join things up a bit more. What we do is we offer nice compliant autism assessments from a multidisciplinary team in a formulation-driven way that are therapeutically informed, and we're led by clinical psychologists, myself and my co-lead, Dr. Sarah Samuels, alongside our managerial colleagues, of course. So who is eligible for our service? We work with school and college-aged young people aged 4 to 17. Or because we know that there are some children who are 4 years old in the reception year, as well as some preschool-aged children who are 4 but not yet in school. We work with young people who have a GP in the East or West Somerset area, or they both live and attend a school here, even if they've got a GP elsewhere, and has not previously been assessed. Some caveats on there. Preschool-aged children on the first one, the assessment pathway for them still remains in paediatrics at Yeovil and Musgrove, and they can be referred to in a different pathway via GP or Maisie. Children in the East Mendip area I've just talked about. Their service, autism assessment service, is run by what was called Virgin Care, and I'm sorry I cannot remember, but I know they've just had a takeover and I can't remember what they're called now, but it's the Bath area service. And also has not previously been assessed, and I think this answers the question in the chat as well, unless there are valid concerns over the outcome or quality of the assessment. So we are not a second opinion service. So if a good quality assessment has been conducted, following nice guidelines from appropriate clinicians in a way that meets the expectations, we would not reassess. We would encourage the GP to seek a second opinion through a second opinion service. We take each request for a second opinion on its merits with that. I will come back to the question on ADHD and autism in a bit, if that's okay. I believe I cover that. So what does this mean for me? So this is the really practical stuff coming up. In the past, referrals for an autism assessment have come primarily from GPs. GPs are great, but with the best will in the world, they have 7 minutes with the family. Apart from hearing, my child has some needs, I'd like him to have an autism assessment, they cannot gather the information needed to inform whether an assessment actually is what this young person needs, or whether their needs are best met through an assessment with a different service around a different idea or thing. However, schools for children who are in school are really well placed to do that, because they've got a wealth of information from their experience working with young people and their parents. So the main change in terms of referral pathways is we have largely stopped GP referrals to our service, and I'll come on to that with the largely. In order to access an autism assessment, we really encourage parents to talk with their school SENCO and discuss their child's needs. This means they can access any appropriate forms of support, because there is support that's available via the pre-assessment pathway that I mentioned earlier on. And if evidence is gathered through that process that suggests an assessment is going to be helpful, then SENCOs can complete with parents the next steps form and send that to our service as a request for an assessment. And then we have a lot of really good, useful and valid information around that. There are other routes for an assessment though. There are young people who are working with other services in Somerset, particularly CAMS, working with young people around their mental health and emotional wellbeing needs. Speech and language therapy around language and communication needs. Occupational therapists around functional and sensory needs. and paediatricians in Yeovil and Musgrove around children's medical needs. They can also refer in for an assessment, although we have advised those colleagues to consider whether it's better to signpost that family back to school SENCOs so they can access that support that is available in that way. And that's an individual decision based on clients' needs and how much information that clinician has got. Likewise, other practitioners from across the system can complete the next steps form with, and we'll put a link to the next steps form in the chat at some point in a bit. Complete the next steps form with parents and young people, giving us all the information if they feel they've got enough, or again, they can recommend back to school SENCOs. GPs can also still refer in, but they must complete a next steps form. And as we mentioned earlier on, GPs perhaps aren't best placed to support families with that. We know that not all children are in school. There are children who are home educated or are finding it really hard to access school for a variety of reasons. Somerset Parent Carer Forum are a fantastic source of support for parents around this. They can support a parent to complete the next steps form, gather that information and send it to us. Sometimes there is disagreement with school over the need for an assessment between a parent and a school. Somerset Sendias, who some of you may be aware of, are an independent body that support families around issues relating to special educational needs. They can help mediate that disagreement where there is some. We have given advice to school SENCOs that if a parent strongly thinks my child needs an autism assessment and they disagree, and even with Sendias's support, we recommend they make that request anyway, but make clear why they don't think that is appropriate in that request on the next steps form from their perspective, allowing parents to give their view as well, and they will consider that in its entirety. Seeing a question in the chat, would that include nursery SENCO as well as school SENCOs? It would not do actually, and that's because the preschool age assessment pathways for autism sit with the paediatric service at Musgrove and Yeovil. That pathway can be accessed via referral from your GP or through the Maisie process from another person working with your child. Our service considers referrals for school and college age young people aged 4 to 17. So what happens to these requests when we receive them? So we receive them and they are then considered by our interagency and multidisciplinary triage team, MDT triage as it's become known as shorthand. The main aim for this is to review the information, the evidence provided, and come to an informed decision about what is the right decision for that young person, whether or not they meet criteria for accessing an autism assessment, or actually whether what's been described are needs relating to other things. And at those times, we will write back to say, actually, we think this would be more helpful, or try this in the first instance. But it's to ensure that those who need an assessment can access one. And that decision is clearly communicated to family, referrer and GP. So moving on now to what actually happens for those who are accepted for an autism assessment. So a quick caveat on this as well, that this is an evolving process. Our service is interim and is evolving through co-production. So we're continually improving and shaping it based on feedback. What I'll talk about now is what we're currently doing, and that will evolve over time as a result. So this diagram is essentially what happens in an autism assessment. A child is accepted for an autism assessment. They are then booked in for an initial appointment with 2 clinicians from different backgrounds. So it might be a paediatrician and a psychologist, a speech and language therapist and an occupational therapist, or another combination of those. In that first appointment, what is offered is a chance for the parent and young person to tell us what's led them to access an assessment. We gather as much background information about the context of a young person's life, including their family background, their early life and development, what their journey through school's been, their physical health and well-being, and what other things might have impacted on them throughout their life. We will talk with the young person, play some games, have a chat, depending on how old the person is, and we will get some really good observations of that young person. Now, in rarer cases, it is possible for us, given that we've got 2 clinicians in that first appointment and have been given a wealth of information from the pre-assessment pathway, there are times that we can conclude that assessment in a single session. And at those times, we're able to give the feedback then and there if the family are ready and aren't exhausted at the end of an hour-and-a-half appointment to give that feedback. Most assessments require further appointments, and we offer those on a needs basis. So there's lots of different assessment tools and approaches we can use. There are ones in clinic, there's observations in school, video appointments with parents, and some of them are on screen in that second orange box. We offer as many or as few as of those that is needed for an individual child to reach an outcome and understand what's led them to access an assessment. We then write a comprehensive assessment report detailing everything that we've gathered and trying to make sense of it and share that outcome with the family and discuss it. As we're an assessment only service, that's essentially the end of our involvement. And we then discharge, but we offer an option of a follow-up appointment to families within 3 months of the letter. I've seen a couple of comments in the chat which I'll come back to a bit later if that's okay. Very aware I've talked pretty much only about autism so far, so a quick note on ADHD. So ADHD pathways are also being redeveloped through co-production in Somerset. The current situation is ADHD is not considered in children aged 5 and under, and the reason for that is that delays in attention and activity can be really normal in that age group, and those skills are still developing as time goes on. So it's not often considered appropriate to assess ADHD in a young person that young. The assessment pathways that are there for ADHD currently are split according to age group. So the primary school age pathway for children aged 6 to 11, and those requests are sent to us, the Children and Young People's Neurodevelopmental Partnership, using ideally the Next Steps form, but any of the other referral pathways I described earlier on. Our role is just to consider that referral and come back with a decision as to whether that young person meets criteria, and that's why we've got an interagency multidisciplinary triage team. The assessments for those that are accepted are still offered by the paediatrics department in Musgrove and the community paediatrics department in Yeovil. The secondary school and college aged ADHD pathway continues to sit with CAMS, and referrals to them can be made in a similar way as well. So thank you. That's really everything I wanted to go over today, and I hope that's been really helpful. If there's any questions, please do feel free to ask them.